At dawn, the Colosseum was already alive. Not with cheers yet, but with preparation. Dust from yesterday's slaughter still clung to the stone. Vendors shouted under the seats, selling olives and watered wine to crowds that hadn't even sat down. Iron gates rattled as handlers shoved starving lions, stamping elephants, and panthers clawing at bars into place. Somewhere in the tunnels below, swords rang out, not for practice, but to make sure they'd kill cleanly. And above it all, a low hum grew louder as tens of thousands of Romans poured in, hungry for the one thing their empire had perfected better than roads, laws, or armies: death, packaged as entertainment. Because this arena wasn't just about sport, it was a machine, a place where emperors proved their power by flooding the sand, starving animals, and turning executions into theater, where cheering in the stands wasn't just noise, it was loyalty. And today, we're stepping inside the most brutal arena acts that went too far, even for Rome. Blood-soaked funerals, mythological executions, animal slaughters, and spectacles so cruel they shocked ancient writers themselves. So take your seat, the gates are creaking open, and the show is about to begin. So with the crowd settling in and the sand freshly raked, it's worth knowing this whole nightmare didn't start as entertainment at all. Rome's obsession with arena blood began somewhere far quieter, somewhere far more personal, at a funeral. Back in 264 BC, Rome didn't have emperors soaking up applause in purple robes. There was no Colosseum, no roaring mobs, just a family in mourning. When Decimus Junius Brutus Scaeva died, his sons decided that statues and speeches weren't enough. To honor their father properly, they did something unthinkable. They armed 6 slaves, paired them off, and forced them to fight to the death in the Forum Boarium, a cattle market that already reeked of smoke, sweat, and rot. Blood soaked into the dirt where livestock had stood hours before. This wasn't called entertainment. The Romans called it amunus, a duty owed to the dead. The idea came from older Italian traditions, especially in Campania, where warriors were killed at graves to appease restless spirits. Over time, sacrifice turned into combat, random victims became chosen men, death became organized. The custom spread fast. Families realized that a blood-soaked funeral didn't just honor the dead, it advertised power. Anyone could bury a man with gold. Only the elite could bury him with corpses. The message was loud and clear. This family commanded life and death. Nobody in that cattle market could have guessed what they'd unleashed. What began as ritual obligation was already mutating into spectacle. And once Rome tasted that kind of power, there was no turning back. But funerals were just the beginning, because soon Rome figured out how to turn private bloodshed into public control, and that's where things really start to spiral. That funeral fight lit the spark, but Rome didn't stop there. Once leaders realized how powerful blood could be in front of a crowd, the games stopped being private rituals and started becoming public weapons. By the 3rd century BC, magistrates figured out something dangerous. Gladiatorial combat didn't just honor the dead, it distracted the living. Religious festivals that were supposed to celebrate gods suddenly morphed into blood-soaked crowd pleasers. The Ludi Romani, once solemn ceremonies for Jupiter, suddenly featured armed men killing each other in full view of the people. Officially, it was piety. Unofficially, it was politics. The Senate loved to pretend this was tradition. The crowd knew better. These were state-funded spectacles designed to buy loyalty. Bread in one hand, blood in the other. Cheer, and the empire keeps working. Even the fighters themselves were carefully chosen symbols. Early gladiators were dressed to look like Rome's old enemies: the Samnite with his heavy shield, the Thracian with a curved blade, the Gaul with a long sword. Every fight replayed Roman conquest in miniature. Every fallen body reminded the audience who ruled the world. And the arenas evolved right along with the message. Temporary wooden stands gave way to permanent stone amphitheaters. Violence wasn't an event anymore. It had an address. The games no longer belonged to grieving families. They belonged to the state. It commanded death itself. But nobody, not senators, not spectators, not even the gods, could have predicted how far this hunger for spectacle would go. Because once Rome mastered killing men for applause, it set its sights on something bigger and far more savage. Those early gladiator fights were brutal, sure, but Rome always wanted more shock, more proof of power. And that's when the arena turned its hunger outward, toward the farthest edges of the empire. The roar of the crowd wasn't always for men. Sometimes it was for beasts dragged in from places most Romans would never see. Lions from North Africa, leopards from the Caucasus, crocodiles hauled up the Nile, even giraffes, creatures so strange Romans didn't know what to call them. They weren't marvels of nature, they were props, shipped in to die. Romans called these spectacles venationes, hunts, but they weren't hunts in any real sense. There was no sport, no danger, just domination. Animals were starved, weakened, and released into the sand to be slaughtered for cheers. Julius Caesar set the tone in 46 BC when he unveiled the first giraffe ever seen in Rome. The crowd stared in awe. Then it was killed. Not studied, not spared, destroyed. The scale was unreal. When the Colosseum opened in AD 80, Emperor Titus reportedly had over 9,000 animals killed in a single festival. Lions were pitted against each other. Bears were stabbed by armed hunters. Elephants, once the terror of Roman legions under Hannibal, were butchered for applause. Archaeologists later found animal bones marked by starvation. The cruelty wasn't accidental, it was engineered. Getting these animals there was a spectacle itself. Caravans crossed deserts with chained beasts. Ships carried cages across seas. Handlers died delivering living trophies of conquest. Every animal that collapsed in the sand was a message made flesh. Rome could cage the wild, ship it across the world, and erase it on command. Some emperors couldn't resist turning the hunts into ego trips. Commodus strutted into the arena dressed as Hercules, slaughtering crippled animals to guarantee victory. The crowd clapped because they had to. When the emperor hunts, fear is louder than admiration. But beneath the cheers was something darker. Writers like Pliny the Elder noticed animals disappearing from entire regions. Roman entertainment wasn't just cruel, it was ecological destruction. Species were wiped out for a weekend's thrill. To Rome, it didn't matter. Nature was chaos, the arena turned it into order. Cage it, starve it, kill it. Another brick in the empire's wall of control. And yet, even that wasn't enough, because Rome didn't just want beasts to die, it wanted humans to suffer in new, creative ways. And that's where the games became truly unhinged. After beasts, Rome turned back to people, but not for fair combat. Balance was boring. The crowd wanted surprise, humiliation, and blood, and the arena delivered by stacking the deck every chance it got. Some fighters were never meant to survive. Condemned prisoners were shoved into the sand wearing joke costumes, handed wooden swords, and pushed toward trained gladiators. The crowd laughed as terror set in. These weren't matches, they were executions pretending to be sport. Death with a punchline. Even real gladiators were trapped inside carefully designed theater. Take the Rotarius, armed with a net and trident like a fisherman. His opponent wore a smooth, rounded helmet meant to deflect the net and carried a short sword for close-range killing. The fight wasn't about fairness, it was suspense. Would the net catch? Would the blade land first? The outcome mattered less than the tension. Rome also loved chaos. Some games sent one man against several opponents. Others unleashed entire squads, staged as miniature armies, crashing into each other until the sand turned into mud and blood. Hundreds could die in a single afternoon. The messier it got, the louder the crowd roared. 1st century AD, they fought with real weapons, sometimes against each other, sometimes against animals, sometimes against dwarfs for shock value. Writers mocked them, but the point was clear. No one was off limits. Gender, dignity, identity, It all fed the spectacle. Even armor was weaponized. Some helmets restricted vision or muffled sound, leaving fighters half blind and disoriented while the audience laughed. Others were so heavy they drained strength before a blow was even struck. Protection wasn't the goal. Struggle was. And when gladiators were dressed as conquered enemies, defeat became inevitable. Every loss replayed Roman victory. Every corpse reinforced empire. None of this was accidental. Every mismatch, every gimmick, every cruel rule served one purpose: keep the crowd shocked, hungry, and obedient. Rome didn't just repeat violence, it innovated it. But the darkest turn came when the arena stopped pretending these were contests at all, when death became scripted theater and the victims never had a choice. By midday, when the crowd started getting restless, the arena shifted into something far darker. The gladiators cleared out. The games weren't over. But now the show wasn't about fighting. It was about punishment. Public, unavoidable, and terrifying. Romans called it damnatio ad bestias, condemnation to the beasts. This wasn't justice. It was theater written in blood. The victims were criminals, deserters, rebellious slaves, prisoners of war, anyone the state wanted erased loudly. Their crimes were turned into scripts. Thieves were ripped apart by wolves. Arsonists burned alive. Traitors were fed to lions. Each execution was staged to make a point. And the scale was massive. Under Emperor Trajan, celebrating his conquest of Dacia, thousands of prisoners were killed over 123 days. Not all at once, because pacing mattered. Death was scheduled like acts in a play, spaced out to keep the audience engaged until the next thrill. Animals were weaponized for suspense. Lions were starved until frenzy took over. Bears were prodded from pits until they lunged. Leopards, rare and expensive, were unleashed on unarmed victims just to hear the crowd scream. Would the beast kill fast or toy with its prey? That uncertainty was part of the entertainment. Sometimes, execution was disguised as myth. Prisoners were forced to play legendary figures. Orpheus torn apart by animals, Prometheus chained as vultures circled overhead. It wasn't enough to die, they had to die symbolically. Their bodies turned into punchlines of Rome's culture. Crucifixion followed. Men and women nailed to crosses, their slow deaths unfolding while vendors sold wine and kids played in the stands. Fire came next. Victims were dressed in pitch-soaked garments, the infamous tunica molesta, then set ablaze, stumbling through the sand as living torches. These weren't just killings, they were warnings. Every scream reminded the crowd who held power. Defy Rome, and you won't just die, you'll die in front of everyone. Some philosophers recoiled. Seneca admitted the executions made him more cruel just by watching, but his words vanished under the roar of applause. Rome had perfected a new art form, turning death into a lesson. And somehow, even this wasn't the limit. Because when land executions weren't enough, Rome decided to bring oceans into the city. If killing men and beasts on dry land wasn't enough, Roman emperors did something unthinkable. They summoned the ocean into the city and turned it into another killing floor. These spectacles were called naumachia, mock naval battles, and they were madness on an imperial scale. This wasn't clever theater, it was mass execution dressed up as maritime drama. The fighters weren't trained sailors or heroic warriors, they were condemned men with no escape and no future. Julius Caesar staged the first Grand Naumachia in 46 BC. He ordered a massive basin dug near the Tiber, filled it with water, and launched real ships into it. Thousands of prisoners were forced aboard, armed with sharpened weapons, and told to fight like rival fleets. Catapults fired, archers loosed arrows. Men drowned, burned, or were cut down for applause.
No one walked away. Augustus pushed it even further. In 2 BC, he built a basin nearly 2,000 feet long, complete with its own aqueduct, just to keep it filled. 30 warships clashed on artificial seas, each packed with men already sentenced to die. The message couldn't have been clearer. Rome didn't need nature, it could manufacture it. Then came Claudius. In AD 52, he drained Lake Fucine and staged a naval battle on its waters. Before the fighting began, the condemned reportedly shouted a phrase that would echo through history: "Those who are about to die salute you." Whether planned or spontaneous, it captured the hopelessness perfectly. Even the Colosseum itself may have been flooded for smaller-scale water displays. Engineers designed drains and channels that could turn sand into shallow seas, then empty it again for gladiators the next day. Violence was modular: water in the morning, blood by afternoon. Fire joined water is another tool of control. Victims wearing pitch-soaked tunics were ignited, stumbling through flames as crowds cheered. These deaths were often framed as myths: Hercules burning alive, heroes consumed by fate, theater written in smoke, in screams. Water and fire shared one purpose: domination. To drown men in the city or turn bodies into torches was to prove mastery over nature itself. The emperors weren't just rulers of people, they posed as rulers of the elements. But the most twisted innovation was still to come. Rome didn't just kill people as themselves, it forced them to die as legends. Once Rome had mastered killing bodies, it turned to something even darker: killing meaning. Legends, gods, and heroes were dragged into the arena and stripped of dignity, rewritten in blood. By the late 1st century AD, executions weren't just punishments, they were performances based on famous myths, with condemned prisoners forced into starring roles they could never survive. The cruelty wasn't accidental, the ending was the point. During the inaugural games of the Colosseum in AD 80, the poet Martial described a man cast as Orpheus. In the legend, Orpheus charms wild animals with his music. In the arena, he strummed his lyre, and a bear was released. No enchantment, no mercy. The animal tore him apart as the crowd watched Rome parody its own culture. Another victim played Daedalus, the inventor who escaped Crete on wings of wax. The prisoner was hoisted onto a crude mechanical rig to simulate flight. The mechanism failed exactly as intended. He fell into the arena below, where beasts waited. Martial joked that he should have used real feathers. Even poets joined the mockery. The most disturbing reenactments blurred punishment and humiliation. One spectacle recreated the myth of Pasiphae, cursed to desire a bull. A condemned person, possibly a woman, possibly a disguised man, was forced into a contraption simulating the act before being killed. It wasn't just execution, it was degradation, staged for mass consumption. Fire completed the theater. Victims wearing the tunica molesta were cast as heroes facing fiery trials: Hercules burning alive, Mucius Scaevola proving loyalty in flames. The audience laughed, knowing these heroes were criminals screaming for their lives. This inversion was the point. Rome took myths about sacrifice and courage and turned them into jokes.